For our next example, we're going to introduce the switch multiple selection statement, and we'll do so in the context of a new version of our gradebook case study. Like the preceding version of the gradebook case study, we will still calculate a class average based on grades that the instructor inputs into the program, but in this version of the program we're also going to display a grade report, a letter grade report, based on the grades that were entered. So let me go ahead and run the program first so that you can see it in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is enter a bunch of grades. So let's just go ahead and do that first, and we'll make sure we enter a range of different grade values here. Okay, so we have a bunch of grades, and as you can see, it's asking me to type Control-Z, then press Enter to terminate the input. So let me go ahead and do that, and when I press Enter, then I get the set of grades and a grade report as well, the class average, I should say, and a grade report as well. So a couple of things that are new in this program. The first is that we're showing you how to use the end of file indicator, which you can enter into a program by typing Control-Z, then pressing Enter. We're using that to terminate the input in this program. Once we do that, then we display the grade report consisting of the total of all the grades, the class average, and then the number of A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's there were based on the grades that were entered. Now, anything 90 and above is an A, anything from 80 to 89 is a B, 70 to 79 is a C, 60 to 69 is a D, and anything below 60 is an F. So you can see, for example, there were 3 failing grades, 14, 57, and 45 based on the input up above. Now, first I'm going to take a look at the gradebook test class, because all of the functionality that you've seen in that execution of the program is encapsulated into the gradebook class and manipulates the gradebook's data, which we'll look at in just a moment. So as we did in earlier versions of the gradebook, we have the statement that creates a gradebook object called myGradebook. It's a new gradebook for the class CS 101, Introduction to C# Programming. And then we tell the gradebook to display its welcome message, which was the first part of the output. We tell the gradebook to input the grades, and this is where we'll see that we're now using the end of file indicator to specify when input is complete. And then we had display grade report, which is displaying the final results. So let's take a look at our updated version of class gradebook. Now, as you can see, we have a whole bunch of different instance variables in this version of the program. We have an integer called total, which is going to be the total of all the grades that were entered. An integer called grade counter, which will keep track of how many grades were entered so that we can properly calculate the class average. And we also have counters for A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's so that we can keep track of how many of each letter grade there were based on the numeric grades that were input. In the preceding versions of the gradebook, where we calculated the class average, things like the total and the grade counter were defined as local variables inside the determine class average method that we had defined. Now we're making them instance variables so that we can keep track of this information throughout the execution of the program. We once again still have our auto-implemented property course name. We have a constructor to initialize the course name, and then we have some of our other methods, the display message method, which we called first to display the welcome message. The next thing we did was call our input grades method to do the input of the grades and summarizing of the information. So in input grades, you can see we have a couple of different local variables, an integer called grade where we'll store each grade that we input, and a string called input where we will store a line of text before converting it to a number for input purposes. We prompt the user to enter integer grades in the range 0 to 100 and to specifically type Control-Z, that's our sentinel value in this case, to help us terminate the input, and then press Enter to terminate that input. And at line 43, we start our sentinel controlled loop by first reading the initial input from the user. So console.readLine, as you now know, reads a line of text and stores a string in the variable input in this case. And if in fact the end of file indicator, Control Z, has been input by the user, the result of line 43 or the result of line 55 will be to assign the value null to the string called input. So as long as input is not equal to null, we know that the user entered at least some sort of a value, although it may not have been a correct value, it was some sort of a value. We then take that input string and convert it to an integer using the convert.toInt32 method, which returns an int, as you can see in the tooltip as I hover over the method name. Assuming that converted correctly, because we're not doing exception handling yet, so I'm assuming the user is entering proper integer values, we then take that grade that we just converted from a string and add it to the total. We then increment the grade counter as well. Now in this case, total is the gradebook class's instance variable total, and you can tell that by the tooltip saying gradebook.total in the tooltip, meaning it's a member of the gradebook class. And similarly, grade counter is also an instance variable of the gradebook. And by doing that, we're storing these as data within the gradebook object so that we can use them from other methods later on, such as the one that's going to display the final results. The next thing we do is take the grade that we just added to the total and increment an appropriate counter for the letter grade. We'll go look at that method in a moment. It's another method in our class, so we have the input grades method calling the increment letter grade counter method, and notice that in order to call another method within the same class, we simply specify the name of the method followed by the parameter list, and the argument in this case is the value grade. After processing that grade, we then read the next line of input, and we do that as the last statement in our while loop so that as we come back to the top of the while, we can check to see if the user entered the end of file indicator by typing Control Z. If they did, then this will result in a false condition, and we will proceed to the end of the input grades method. Now again, after inputting the grades, the main method says that we should next display the grade report. So going back over to our source code here, we first did the input grades, and I'll come back to the increment letter grade counter in just a moment. The display grade report method is going to display the results that you saw at the end of the program. So I display the string grade report. I check to make sure my grade counter is not equal to 0 because I don't want to calculate an average and divide by 0. So I perform that calculation, and once again we've used the double cast operator to convert a copy of total's value to a double from an int, and then we divide that by the integer grade counter. When you have a double divided by an integer, you wind up at runtime with a double divided by a double due to the promotion rules inside of C#, and so we wind up with a double average. We then display the total of all the grades that were entered. We display the class average using 0:fs to say at the position 0 we want a floating point number, and by default that will be 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. And then finally we summarize all of the counters, A count, B count, C count, D count, and F count, that represent the number of letter grades for the numeric values that were input into the program. Of course, if no grades were entered, then we'll simply display that at the end of the display grade report method. So going back over to the key new feature in this example, our increment letter grade counter method receives the integer grade as an argument, and then we divide that grade by 10 using integer arithmetic. So again, grade is an integer, and 10 is a struct int32, which is the underneath the hood representation of an integer. So they're both integers. And when you divide one integer by another integer, you get an integer result. So for example, when the user types 100, 100 divided by 10 gives me a result of 10, and I would then match the case at line 66, which increments the variable A count. Now it's important to note that the controlling expression of the switch for C# is a little different than it is in some of the other programming languages that also have the switch statement. In C# you can use any of the numeric types in a switch statement. You can also use strings in a switch statement as well. The basic concept of cases in the switch statement in C# is the same as most C-based languages in that you can only test one value per case. But the other thing that's different about C# is that the break statement is required. You are not allowed to fall through after executing statements to another case. If you want the same statements to be performed for multiple cases, the cases must be listed back to back as shown on line 65. So if I have a grade in the 90s and I divide it by 10, the result will be 9. If I have a grade of 100 and I divide it by 10, the result will be 10. So for the cases of 9 or 10, based on this controlling expression, we will increment the A count and then we will break out of the switch statement. If I remove that statement, interestingly, I'll get a compilation error in C#, unlike C, C++, and Java and some of the other languages that support this switch statement. If the grade is in the 80s, when I divide it by 10, I'll wind up with the integer value 8 and increment the B count. If it's in the 70s, I'll increment the C count. If it's in the 60s, I'll increment the D count. And for any other value, I will execute the default case, which is going to add 1 to the F count. Now that means if I enter a very large grade above 100, or if I enter a negative number, those two would be treated as Fs in this scenario. I am assuming that the user is only entering 0 through 100 as grades. And again, this is not an industrial strength app. It's a demonstration app to show you the syntax of the switch statement. So each time I input a grade up above, I then check that grade's value to figure out which of these counters to increment by using the switch multiple selection statement. And again, the controlling expression can be any integral type. It can also be a string, and your cases, if they are strings, would have double quotes wrapped around the value that you're testing. And both the set of curly braces around the body of the switch and the break statements after the statements in a given case are required in C#. Before moving to the next video, let's just take a quick look at an activity diagram for a switch statement. And again, the way this is going to work is you first evaluate the controlling expression as you enter the switch statement. That value is then compared to make a decision with a given case, starting from the top of the switch and proceeding down through the different cases. If there's a match, you execute the actions for that given case, and then you execute the required break statement that must come after the case's actions, otherwise you'll get a compilation error, and that will break you out of the switch statement itself. If there's no match, you move on to the next case and perform the comparison. If there is a match at that point, we execute the actions and then break out of the switch, and that continues through all the different cases that are provided. And again, you can only group together cases to perform the same set of actions by listing them in the code back to back as we did on lines 65 and 66. If there are no matches to any of the cases, then the default actions, if there are any, will be performed. The default is optional, and at the end of the default statement, you do still need a break if in fact you are going to provide a default case.